Switzerland, that Switzerland plays in that illicit capital flows on a global level, and perhaps also have a look a little bit in the policy of Switzerland and what could be changed in Switzerland from our side. Please, Dominik.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for the invitation and the very interesting presentation, Dick. To start, just I have to say, or to admit that I'm actually one of those NGO guys who are going to speak about the countries. But I totally got your hint, and I will go into it in the future because I think it's a very crucial point, actually. And but probably for my defense, I could say, I mean, taxes is not only about states, right? It's only about citizens. It's also about citizens and the way how we actually distribute money in a society. And if you don't have to distribute anything, there is actually not really something to decide in a common way. So it's also a question. Taxes is at the end also about if a democracy is actually able to work or not.
I'm perfectly in favor of tax.
But I know it's a very reformistic agenda which I'm actually presenting. But that's how far you can go with the Swiss Parliament. So, yeah, yeah, exactly. It's still a very radical left position from the perspective of the Swiss Parliament. So, just to give you an idea about this whole illicit financial flow thing, this is a template made by Eurodot, the European Network on Debt and Development. And actually, illicit financial flows is in itself a political term because there are a lot of different definitions about illicit financial flows. And the one or the other actually gives you a very different political perspective, because some people or some organizations actually only include illegal financial flows into the term illicit financial flows, and the whole tax evasion thing, which Dick gave us this very insightful example of loaning, is actually not illegal from a law side. So here Eurodot, for example, makes a distinction between the illegal illicit financial flows, which you see here, and the profits taken out by foreign investors. And today, actually, we are on the panel here talking about these profits taken out by foreign investors. This is kind of the tax evasion of multinationals. And if you look at the whole picture, you see actually that developing countries, and sorry for using that term, a friend of mine recently suggested that we better speak of cheated countries, but this term is actually not very common at the World Bank and the other organizations which deliver us with the figures we need to show what's actually going on. So as long as World Bank and the IMF officially speak about developing countries, we're kind of obliged to use this term. So you see that actually developing countries at the end are netto donors and not netto debitors. So in a way that, from my point of view, totally changes the kind of general perspective of especially the North or so-called developed countries on the south. So about 2 times more money is taken out from developing countries than actually flowing in. And aid, for example, aid money, in respect to profits taken out, you see that aid money is about 10 cents and profits taken out is about 42 cents. So it's like 4 times more money is taken out to tax havens like Switzerland than actually flowing into developing countries over aid money. And now, what's the special role of Switzerland in all this this game. It's very hard to give you like exact figures. Actually, this is already the question of figures we can approach is very political. Lately, the Swiss government actually published a report which goes back to a submission in Parliament 3 years ago, where we and with our partners in the Parliament actually asked for exact figures on the specific role of Switzerland in illicit financial flows from developing countries. And the government actually presented us a very enlightful analysis of the global problem and of the global system of illicit financial flows, but didn't say anything about the specific role of Switzerland. So you see, actually Switzerland is very good in kind of analyzing the international community and analyzing and criticizing other countries, but not from a self-reflective perspective. Kind of nothing really is coming up, so it's very hard to estimate the figures, and we have to go closer into kind of analysis made by ourselves or actually case studies. So what we know is that approximately 30% of global offshore wealth, so not only multinational offshore activities, but also private offshore activities, like which actually most of the Panama Papers were about private offshore activities. So you can estimate that 30% of global offshore wealth is actually stored somehow or flows into Switzerland and out to Switzerland. And so why is that? On the one hand, we have a tradition since the 30s of storing money, and on the other hand, you can also say Switzerland is a small market with big loopholes. And if you're a small market and you want to be attractive for multinationals, you in a way have to present them something else than a market if you're a small market and not a big one. So loopholes is actually a very crucial point in this kind of sense for the Swiss economy. So it's in a way not a coincidence that a lot of interests in Switzerland are fighting so hard to actually keep this offshore industry in Switzerland in one way or another. In a way, we see a shift from a private offshore industry to a tax haven for multinationals since like in the last 15 years, you can say. So a shift also from the finance industry to the extractive industry. And the way how actually Switzerland is making international tax policies in a way is a contradiction to the principle of policy coherence, which is actually an official government policy or declared by the Swiss government, which means that no foreign policy activity should actually be in contradiction to another. So you can say if you have a very good kind of working aid system on the one hand, and you got like a tax evasion industry on the other hand, you're kind of playing them out. So this is a very kind of also from a very modest political standpoint a problem, but even that is very hard to address in the Swiss Parliament as it presents itself at the moment. And it's also obviously in the contradiction to the UN Agenda 2030 for Sustainable Development, where you also have goals of against the industry of illicit financial flows. Yeah. So, and if you now go to an example, I mean, I guess the examples which Dick gave us are very delightful. So I don't really go into details about Glencore and Zambia, but just to give you some numbers, Glencore actually shifted around $174 million in the last 15 years from from a mine, from the copper mine in Wolfira to Bar in the canton of Zug. Yeah, that was profit shifting, mostly working over transfer pricing, and in a way, what I can probably say more about it in a general way is that the basic principle which actually allows all this transfer mispricing is the so-called arm's length principle. So if you take into account that around 60% of world trade, or like world trade, which cross-border world trade, is actually not working between different, totally independent companies, but inside multinationals. So 60%, I mean, you don't really, it's actually, we're not really living in a so-called free market world, right? This is kind of a myth. So 60% is trade, which is kind of working like the example of Lohnmin showed us before. So the problem there is that the arm's length principle, the idea of the arm's length principle is that if you have inside trade, inside multinationals, that you actually estimate prices, because you don't have markets, so you have to find another way to define your prices. You define prices that you, in the way that you say, okay, for example, we deliver computers from Bar to our daughter firm in Wolfira, and on the normal market, you estimate like this and this price for these computers. So if you want to, but the problem is for a lot of stuff, there is not really a market price because the market is too small in respect to the trade which is going on inside companies. So that means that it's actually not the market who is deciding the prices, but the managers inside the multinationals. So that's why, in a way, transfer pricing can be used for profit shifting, because you just put up the prices, for example, for computers or for multinational inside loans. You just calculate like overpriced interest rates, then you would have to pay on a normal market. So now, when it comes to possible policy steps against the system, the most common agenda on this at the moment is the OECD so-called base erosion and profit shifting agenda, which is actually a strange term because it should actually be called anti-base erosion and profit shifting agenda. But in a way, probably it's not really an anti-base erosion and profit shifting agenda, so probably the name is right. So one of the major point in the BEPS agenda, which actually Switzerland signed this agreement at the OECD in last October. So Switzerland is kind of obliged to bring up the 4 minimal standards which are defined in this agreement. And one of these minimal standards is the so-called country-by-country reporting, which means at the end the idea is actually to get transparency on these templates which Dick showed us before. So Dick in a way made a kind of country-by-country reporting work, and the idea is that not NGOs with a lot of have to be kind of dependent from failures and errors of the management to accidentally present these figures to NGOs, but actually the idea is that at least tax administrations get these papers and they exchange it between them on an automatic exchange level. But originally the idea of the country-by-country reporting, which was brought up by NGOs 15 years ago was actually to make it public. So the idea is that you go on a website and there you find, in a way, these templates which they presented us before about on loan-in. So here you see a country-by-country report of the UBS in Europe. And the reason why we have that is actually that for financial intermediaries in the European Union, country-by-country reporting is already in charge. But it's not a very good country-by-country reporting because you don't really read out a lot of interesting stuff out of it. And actually what you don't see, you have the figures on how many people are working in one country for UBS, then profits and turnover, but you don't really have the architecture of the whole multinational, right? So that makes it very hard to figure out where actually profit shifting is going on. And that's exactly the problem about the way how Switzerland now wants to implement this country-by-country reporting. The minimal standard of the OECD doesn't say that you also have to present a so-called master file. The master file would look like more or less exactly what you presented before about loan-in. And so the Swiss state actually decided to not include the master file. So in a way, companies or tax administrations in other countries, they get a country-by-country report, which actually looks more or less like that. But only, for example, for Germany, this one, because here you have like different countries. And that's all. So in a way, the country-by-country reporting which Switzerland is suggesting at the moment is totally useless to present or to actually estimate transfer pricing and transfer mispricing. That was also kind of said by a woman of the Swiss tax administration in a conference to me 2 days ago. So yeah, here you see the kind of the way how it works from the international level down to Switzerland. And this is the template which the Swiss administration is proposing for the country-by-country reporting. And so another problem is that the tax administrations in the countries of the subsidiaries, so here and here, are totally dependent from the country where the headquarter of the multinational is. So here you have another kind of power imbalance between mostly southern countries like South Africa and northern countries like Switzerland. Why is that? Because the whole BEPS erosion and profit shifting system was developed inside OECD, which is actually a club of rich countries, and not, for example, in the UN, where you have totally other power structures than inside OECD. I mean, OECD said, or is saying now, that they want to create the so-called equal footing principle, which means that developing countries can sit at the table, but the whole system, in a way, is already developed. So the whole system, in a way, is working against tax administrations in developing countries. So another idea for a so-called progressive agenda for global tax justice would be to shift kind of the international work on international taxation from the OECD to the UN. So we're actually starting to campaigning now with our friends in Brussels and Paris and New York and Nairobi to shift kind of the power from OECD to UN and to develop a so-called global tax body at the UN. Then, if you wanna replace the so-called arm's length principle, which I showed before, which is kind of responsible transfer mispricing, or the possibility of shifting, of being able to shift profits is actually unitary taxation, which means basically, it's quite complicated, but basically you can say it means that subsidiaries of multinational companies are not taxed anymore separately, but you make first a calculation where you say, okay, all these firms are are being part of the same multinational, which for that you actually need country by country reporting, so it's a whole kind of new system. Are all part of the same enterprise, so we kind of calculate the whole revenues of the whole multinational, and then you kind of separate the tax income again per subsidiary. So this is another idea how we actually how we overcome this very weak principle of the arm's length principle. Obviously public country by country reporting, which would be also from a kind of public perspective would be a very good idea, because it makes movements, political movements and campaigners and everybody kind of independent of the data which tax administrations publish, right? So in countries where you don't really have a reliable tax administration, it would be actually very important to get public information on tax revenues. Yes, and then the last thing is this kind of beneficial ownership principle. This is mostly interesting when it comes to private tax evasion. That's something which came up with the Panama Papers too. So the idea is that if you have a kind of very complicated offshore structure, which we saw in the Panama Papers, and for which Bermuda is an example. Bermuda is an island where a lot of these shell companies are actually stored. So that's also what Lone Min used to shift profits to Bermuda, right? So beneficial ownership principle means that you actually disclose in public registries at the end the kind of the final